Okay, welcome back to 사랑과영문학, to Love and Literature. And today we continue our look at atonement, of course. And just to give you some feedback, so far good job on the prep sheets. I was pleased by what I saw both in looking through them, but also the way that you were able to use them in class last time. Right? So when I called upon you and asked people what your thoughts were, all were able to use your prep sheets and to reply. So that's their function. Okay, so just like we did last time, I'm going to talk about some of the ideas and themes and key passages that I picked out, and then we will turn to your prep sheets and your ideas and see what are some of the things that you picked out that you thought were important as we go through the text. So for today, last time we read chapters 1 and 2. For today we read chapters 3, 4, and 5, right, of part 1. Right? Remembering some of those key elements that we saw last time, such as we saw that there is a perspective within any literary text. We need to think about like who is telling the story. Is it a first-person narrative, telling it from the perspective of I, or is it, as it is in this part, is a third-person narrative, right? And we saw how that is important for how we understand and we receive the story that's being told to us, because a first-person narrative tends to be perceived as more biased, more subjective, right? Inherently so, right? Whereas a third person, we tend to trust more. We tend to take it that they have, for fictional purposes, knowledge of the thoughts, the ideas, motivations, and actions of the characters in the story, all right? So that's a very important distinction that we see there between the first person and the third person. So far, our story has been all in third person, right? And we saw also that with each chapter, even though it's third person narrator, nonetheless, whose thoughts we're seeing, whose ideas we're seeing also tend to shift with each chapter. So chapter 1 we saw focus on, who was it? Who is the main character that was focused chapter 1? Bryony. Chapter 2? Cecilia, right? And so we see this continues to change in chapters 3, chapters 4, chapters 5, right? Jumps from perspective to perspective, right? We tend to focus on one character at a time. All right. So last time I spoke in quite a great detail on chapter 1, right? We focused on that character of Bryony, and we looked at some of the sort of the ways in which we get to see into her character, that Ian McEwan gives us these ideas and clues about what she's like, right? So we noticed, first of all, one of the most important things about her character is her age, right? We saw that she's 13 and that she is on this sort of difficult threshold between deciding whether she is old enough to be considered adult and therefore more responsible for her actions, right? Because we see that she has increasing interest in adult things, right? And in being treated like an adult, right? Because remember, she's the baby, the youngest of the family. So a lot of her life, she's been treated like a sort of spoiled youngest child, right? But she's starting to reject that. She's starting to want to be treated more like an adult. And the adult things that she starts to be interested in revolve around things like marriage, sex, and those sorts of things that, you know, her family hasn't really told her about at this point, or parents haven't really told her about at this point, right? So her being on this sort of threshold between adulthood and childhood, this in-between space, is very important for the character of Bryony and how we understand what she thinks and how she behaves. Right? We also saw that there are some other rather more peculiar, because of course everyone at some point in their life, all of us, at some point we're 12 or 13, right? And we all were on that edge of going from childhood to adulthood. We've all been through that. That's universal, but there are also some other particular characteristics about Bryony. We see that she's obsessed with writing. We see that through her writing and her imagination, she likes to feel that she controls things, right? She can control her fantasy world, and she likes to believe that she can also control, to some extent, her real world around her. We see as well that she's very much obsessed with order, right? She puts all of her toys and all of her possessions in a particular order, right? And we also see that connected to this is that she has a very strong sense of what we call moral reward and justice, right? She has this idea, a little bit simple and a little bit childish, that good people get rewarded, bad people get punished, and the world is very black and white in those childish sort of terms, right? So that was the focus that we got from looking at Bryony. Today I want to talk a little bit more about her sister, Cecilia, who we know is 10 years older than her, so there's quite a big age gap between the two of them, right? And so, of course, Cecilia is already an adult. Right? So, like I did last time, I guess before we get into those themes, just some extra little terms here to help you with some of the language. On page 24, you'll see the mention of Whitehall, and this is, it's sort of like, you know, when people in America might mention, you know, the Pentagon, everyone knows what that is, right? Because it's famous as being like the center of the defense. In the same way, Whitehall is famous as in London as being the center for where all the public servants tend to work, right? It's a particular area of London. So we know that their father is a public servant and probably quite a high-ranking, well-paid, and well-connected man. All right. Just a little more slang. A bit rich, in this case, doesn't have anything to do with money, just means a bit too much, right? A bit over the top. Okay. And there's also a mention of Paul Marshall looking a bit like a character called Desperate Dan. This is this cartoon character, so to give you some idea of what McEwen is referring to. Although I actually looked it up, and it's what we call an anachronism, because remember, this story is set in 1935, and Desperate Dan was first created in 1937, so a little bit of a disparity there. But nonetheless, here are some of those things just to help you along. Okay, so like I said, today I'm going to shift from looking at Bryony, that we looked at last time, to having a little bit more focus upon Cecilia. Now, Cecilia is finding that, and we'll see this in these opening chapters, Cecilia is finding that now that she really is starting to enter the world of adulthood, right? She's been through school, been through high school, she's just finished university, right? And now she has to decide what she's going to do with her life. And she's finding that things are a bit more complicated, a bit more chaotic than she had expected, right? She's not like a child like Bryony is, or on the threshold of childhood. She definitely is an adult, right? She knows about life, she knows about sex, she knows about marriage, right? She has some experience of the world, but she's just coming into experiencing some of these adult things for the first time in her life, right? So there are a number of references and clues and symbols that are included in some of these chapters that have to do with Cecilia and order and disorder, right? We've seen some of the things that Bryony does. She has her plays to try and create order. She has her toys. She has her secret possessions. All of these are designed to create order in her life. Whereas Cecilia is finding that she has to create her own order in her life, and that a lot of adult life is about creating a kind of order in your life out of the disorder that happens around you, all right, out of the random events, out of the circumstances that face you, right? So one of the ways in which we can already sort of, I didn't put this on the slides, but one of the ways in which we can already start to think about this, for example, is the novels that she is reading, right? Remember, Cecilia is reading Richardson's Clarissa, right? And remember I told you Clarissa is it's a later book than Pamela, which is the second novel by Samuel Richardson, and even longer, very, very long, one of the longest novels in the English language, and it's written as a series of letters, right, back and forth. And the idea of a lot of these early novels from the 18th century is that they take things that are just part of the everyday life, like letters or journals or histories, right? And they turn them into an ordered narrative, right? So it's important to read the letters together, and then you get this sense of a developing story, right? There's a similar sense in which Cecilia is sort of thinking about her life in this, trying to think about her life in this way, right? That there are these things that are happening to her, and she's trying to create a narrative of where is she going to go? What is her career going to be? What is her life going to be like? Is she going to get married and have children? Is she going to have a career? What is she going to do with this life, especially now that she's just graduated, right? Remembering, of course, the setting of this story is also particularly important because in the 1930s, women had a much different set of opportunities and expectations than, of course, they do now, right? Not that things are perfect, but right, we see that there are, there's a lot of changes going on in Great Britain at this time that are sort of in the background of Cecilia's mind, right? Because, for instance, this is 1935. Women only got the right to vote in Great Britain in 1928, so 7 years before this story is told. Only recent in the British time, in the time of this story, that women were allowed to get degrees from places like Cambridge, right? They were earlier on in the century allowed to study there, but when they finished, they weren't allowed to be given a degree, right? So lots of changes going on in the world in which Cecilia is living, both in the world beyond her, right, in the status of women, in the changing nature of society, and also in her own life. What is she going to do? What is her future going to hold for her? Everything seems up in the air. So, as I said, there are a number of symbols that we can see of order and disorder, of the attempts through art and through architecture and various other ways to create order in our world that are referenced in the course of, particularly of Cecilia's thoughts and what is happening to her. So we can see these, for example, in chapter 2, right, where we get a small description and we'll get bits added to it as the narrative goes along of the Tallis house and its land that it's on, right? Now, we're given a description of some of these things, and I'll show you some pictures of them. And all of them, in these cases, have to do with order, right? Of creating a sense of order, a sense that everything is in its right place, everything has its correct position in the world, right? So let's take a look at some examples of these. This is the fountain, or at least, remember, a half-size copy of this fountain that the Tallis family has in their garden, I guess you could call it, right? So this is where the fountain scene takes place in chapters 2 and 3, right? And in this particular sculpture, it's in Rome originally, right? We have Triton, who is a sort of, he's not as famous as like Poseidon or the great god of the sea, but he's one of the gods of the sea. and around him are mermaids and other sort of symbols of the sea. And of course, he is he's blowing into a big shell, and out of that comes the water. Okay. Now this particular statue and this particular fountain was designed by a very famous sculptor from the Renaissance period, right? This guy Bernini, right? You can see the dates there in the middle of the 17th century. And for those of you who are not familiar, the Renaissance, that particular word means rebirth, right? It comes from the French. Naissance means birth. So renaissance, to be born again. And what's being born again? Well, the idea is that in this period, from around the 14th century through to Bernini's time, was a rediscovery of the Greek and Roman styles, ideas, and culture, right? So for a long time, because of lots of problems in Western culture, because of lots of wars, there wasn't as much availability, because of course during this time there's the invention of the printing press, which makes texts much more widely available, and all sorts of other reasons. The access to the Greeks and the Romans was very limited before the Renaissance. So the Renaissance was a rediscovery of many of the Greek and Roman ideas. And so this led to a flowering of art, of literature, of philosophy, right, during this time of the Renaissance, right? And so in architecture, and in art, many of the ideas were based upon going back to the principles of Greek and Roman styles, of the classical style. Right? And one thing about the Greeks and the Romans, particularly the Greeks, is that they were very interested in trying to work out the rational parts of the world. Right? They believed that ultimately the world was rational and could be explained. Right? So that means that the styles that they used to reflect in their architecture, right, in the buildings that they created, in the houses that they created, also reflected this sense of order. Right? So that means what would be the most rational way to construct a house? Well, for the classicists and the neoclassicists is for straight lines, right? No curves, no arches, nothing bendy, nothing too ornate, right? Straight, clean, rational, logical lines, right? So Bernini, he chooses a Greek god as his choice of subject, right? Because he's looking back to the ideas, to the myths, to the culture, to the ideas of the Greeks, right? In this sense, the Renaissance sculptor like Bernini is neoclassical, right? Even though this particular statue is not particularly neoclassical in its style. What is much more clearly neoclassical are some of the other things that are mentioned. Now, remember, this is not the actual style of the house that currently the Taluses have. Remember, we're told that the original house that had been built in the century before had burned down, right? And they built this fairly ugly modern house in its place, right? We're told that, or at least the narrator seems very unimpressed with the current Talus house. But the style of the house that came before it was this, Adam-style neoclassical house, right? And you can see here, right, neoclassical, straight lines, right, all very orderly, very logical, right? And that's a style that was very popular in the late 18th century when neoclassicism was at its peak, right? So remember, we're told that the construction of the Tallis house is that, okay, originally there was the Adams-style house, like this one. There was the Triton fountain nearby. And then closer to that, or a little further from that, there is a little lake with an island and a temple on it and a couple of bridges that go over to that temple, right? And then a few years later, after it's built, the house burns down. So all of the other things that are supposed to accompany this style of house are still left there, but then they build this new modern house, right? So these are meant to be symbols of order, and then of course the fire itself is kind of a disorder. It messes things up, right? It ruins the original sort of balance of how things were in this building site. And they create this new, ugly, modern building. All right. And then we can see, this is a painting here of, later on we learn the name of the guy who designed this style of temple, right? Nicholas Rege. And he, this temple, again, comes from the same time period as the Adams-style house, the late 18th century, the late 1700s, right? And its purpose, normally you think a temple, oh, that's religious, right? But in this case, it's not, right? In this case, the temple, as you can see here, it's not to any god. It's not to any deity. It's not to any supernatural being. It's there purely for decoration, right? It's like, oh, well, the Greeks had similar kinds of buildings. The Romans had similar kind of buildings. Let's have one of those, right? And so we find out later, that it's specified in a later chapter, that yes, this temple, it has no religious function, right? It's purely there for decoration. It's a neoclassical decoration. It's there as a sort of sign of both order and beauty, right? It's there to look nice, basically. All right, so these three things that we've seen so far: the fountain, the Adams-style house, of course, which burnt down, is replaced by a modern house, and this temple here. They all, as I said, they all borrow from the obsession and the interest in order that the Greeks and the Romans, the classical culture of classical side of Western culture had. Right? Now we see, on the other hand, the other symbol that I've picked out here is that of the wildflowers, right? In which we see a rather different style or aesthetic going on, in which we see, instead of trying to create logical, rational, like linear style of order, the wildflowers have an attempt to have beauty that is unordered, disordered, right? And yet what's kind of funny about it is, or contradictory about it, is that she has to try and arrange the flowers to look chaotic. Have to arrange the wildflowers in the vase to make them look as if they have fallen there naturally, right? So, wait a minute, isn't natural meant to be that you don't have to arrange things? Isn't it just however it is, right? But in this case, there's a deliberate contradiction here that McEwen is playing with. The natural, in this case, has to be created artificially. So we see on page 12 of our packet, says that she spent some minutes making adjustments in order to achieve a natural, chaotic look, right? So to make it look chaotic, to make it look wild, but she's arranging it, right? So it's false chaos, it's false wildness. Okay. So we see Cecilia herself in this next quote. She starts thinking herself about the way in which life, in which the things that she does, in which the way that she behaves, the way that she thinks about the world these are things that don't always fit in with our desires, within our plans, within our expectations of how life is going to turn out, right? She thinks to herself, it says there, not everything people did could be in a correct, logical order, right? So here we see her acknowledging to herself, all right, I might try to create order, I might try to create a narrative out of my life, I might try to create a life that I want to live, but it doesn't always work out that way, right? Life comes along and it throws surprises at you that you don't expect. Okay. So we can see this as well in the symbol of the vase, which we talked about in our very first class, right? That similarly, the life of Uncle Clem seems to be one that also is touched by this kind of unexpected randomness, right? Remember, Uncle Clem is the one who, through his bravery, right, saves the lives of several people in World War I, and the town awards him this very expensive vase, right, for keeping the flowers in. And yet, Uncle Clem also dies just a week before, it says here, just a week before the armistice, just before the war ends, right? So even though he's a war hero, even though he does all these things, and he sort of has been presented with this wonderful vase and he's a hero, nonetheless, he still dies unexpectedly just before the war ends. Just also, I have there one further little clue about those connections back to Greek and Roman culture. So when Cecilia is described getting out of the fountain, right? Remember, we have the scene by the fountain. Bryony is watching on. Robbie and Cecilia sort of, they don't really fight, but they sort of squabble over who is going to dip the water, dip the fountain, the vase into the fountain, and they accidentally break off part of the vase, right? And then Cecilia, in a strange moment, she just decides, fine, I'm going to take my clothes off and jump in and get the bit of broken vase, and then jump out, and meanwhile Robbie is like, what is going on here? Whoa, this is unusual, this is strange, right? And it said when she emerges from the fountain, she's described in McEwen's terms as a frail white nymph, right? And most of the ones that we know about are the big gods, right? The very powerful, majestic gods, you know, Zeus and Mars and so on, right? But they also believed in lots of little gods, right? So these are sort of like fairies tend to be associated with, like, you know, local things. So too, the Greeks and the Romans had this sort of whole spirit world of things very similar to fairies. And so nymphs and dryads, which is a tree version of this, right? Nymphs lived in water, tended to live in water. Dryads tended to live in trees. They were like spirits, or like minor gods, right? Little gods that inhabited a tree, or a lake, or a river, right? So here we have Cecilia presented to us. You know, she's already dived into a fountain that portrays the god Triton, and then she's described as if she is this nymph emerging from the water, coming out from the water, right? So nymphs, of course, are supposed to be beautiful, they're supposed to be goddesses, but we also see that it's connected back to these Greek and Roman ideas about order and rationality as well, right? Okay. So I wanted to take a little bit further look at some of these quotations because so far we've looked at quotations about Cecilia from chapter 2, and I want to look at a couple from today's reading. This is from page 23. Okay. And again, we start to see that McEwen is getting us to think a little bit more about order and what is natural, what is nature, is nature really orderly, right? And as I said, we see it through this metaphor of the symbol of the wildflowers. Cecilia went to the kitchen to fill the vase and carried it up to her bedroom to retrieve the flowers from the hand basin. When she dropped them in, they once again refused to fall into the artful disorder, right? Which is a kind of a contradiction in terms, right? Artful doesn't just mean artistic. It means like careful, right? Calculated, right? The opposite of this is artless, which means innocent, right? So artful is thought through, careful. Artful disorder she preferred, and instead swung round in the water into a willful neatness, with the taller stalks evenly distributed around the rim. She lifted the flowers and let them drop again, and they fell into another orderly pattern. Still, it hardly mattered. It was difficult to imagine this Mr. Marshall complaining that the flowers by his bedside were too sympathetically displayed, right? So here we can see McEwen gets us to think about the nature of order. Is order just something that happens naturally, or is it something that is created? Even something that looks sort of deliberately messy, right? Like the wildflowers, has to be created, has to be artificial. Now, there's some resonances of this idea in the history of English literature. In particular, I kept thinking about this poem by Robert Herrick, right? Very famous 17th century poet. And in this particular poem, he's describing the way in which normally we would think of someone dressed up perfectly would be attractive. And then he says, well, sometimes the opposite is also true, right? Sometimes he says, if I see a woman and her clothing is a little bit out of place, right? That also can be quite attractive, right? So let's look at the poem. Sweet disorder in the dress, right? So something a little bit out of place, shirt untucked, or a bit of blouse showing, or something like that. Kindles in clothes a wantonness, right? A desire, wantonness. A lawn about the shoulders thrown, not a lawn as in grass, but a lawn means linen, right? About the shoulders thrown into a fine distraction. An airing, which means a wandering, moving, a lace that's out of place, which here and there enthralls the crimson stomacher. Stomacher was a kind of, if you've seen old-fashioned, sort of like a, not exactly a corset, but they sort of go over a woman's torso, right? Sort of very stiff, usually lots of decoration on it, very sort of ornate, lots of stitching and stuff like that goes into making them, right? So this is like a stomacher, goes over your torso, over the woman's torso, sort of have the sort of like cut off here, right, around the breasts, okay, and goes down here. Enthralls the crimson stomacher, a cuff neglectful, so a cuff just out of place, and thereby ribbons to flow confusedly. A winning wave, deserving note in the tempestuous petticoat, a careless shoestring in whose tie I see a wild civility. Well, to make it rhyme, you say civility instead of civility. Do more bewitch me than when art is too precise in every part. So he's saying here, oh, you can tell something about a woman's character if she's too perfectly dressed, right? Maybe she's too uptight and maybe too stiff and not very fun to be around. He says, but he says like, because you can see he's talking to a woman here. Yeah. He's saying like, when I see you and like I just see a little bit out of, like your dress is just a little bit out of order. I can tell, oh, you dress well, but also you can be fun, right? You can get a bit wild sometimes, right? And so there's this resonance here. Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk about this next time because I want to leave some time to talk about our homework and our prep sheets. So just to recap of the theme that I was talking about today, last time we talked about Bryony and her obsession, very childish obsession with order, right? And having the world in her very childish, selfish way. Whereas we see in Cecilia's case, she is starting to engage with these adult ideas, not of childishly trying to force the world to be as it is, but rather trying to make sense of her own life, of trying to arrange things. And we see it through this struggle for her to create her own life and her own meaning in that life through some of these symbols. The house, the temple, the statue in the fountain, the wildflowers, all of these represent her attempts to create a sense of meaning and purpose out of her own life as she moves into adulthood herself. Okay, so let's turn now to our prep sheets and to our homework, and I would like you to tell me what are some of the passages that you thought were important during the reading for today. Thank you. All right, well, we are out of time for today. Please hand in your prep sheets as you go, and we'll come back on Thursday to take a look at the next few chapters. Okay, thank you.